Have you ever felt completely shattered after a single criticism, as if one word was enough to dismantle you from the inside, to corrode your confidence and make you question whether you have any worth at all? Have you ever felt that someone's rejection, even if small and seemingly insignificant, confirms your worst fears about yourself? That another person's silence is deafening because it echoes in your head like an accusation, a verdict on your inadequacy? If you live in this state of constant emotional vulnerability, perhaps you've been taught to believe that the problem is being too sensitive. Maybe you've internalized that you need to toughen up or stop caring about what others think. But what if I told you that the problem is not sensitivity? What if the real problem is structure, or rather, the lack of it? Carl Gustav Jung called this condition a permeable ego, a psychic state where there are no clear boundaries between your internal world and the external world. Every criticism pierces you like an arrow shot directly at your core. Every rejection punctures your sense of self. Every other person's opinion drags you away from yourself, from your center. And the worst part? You start to believe that this suffering is your fault, as if there's something fundamentally wrong with feeling so much, with being affected so deeply. But that's not what Jung saw when he looked at this pattern. He didn't see weakness or character flaw. He saw interrupted development. He saw a person whose psychological structure was never properly built. The harsh truth is that many of us grew up without ever building psychological armor, not because we are weak, but because no one taught us how. Perhaps you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where you had to behave a certain way to be accepted, to be valued. Perhaps your emotions were systematically ignored, ridiculed, or invalidated. You're being dramatic. Stop being so sensitive. There's no reason to feel that way. Maybe every mistake was treated as proof that you weren't enough, that you needed to be different, to be worthy. And over time, imperceptibly, you learned to measure yourself entirely by the gaze of others. You became dependent on external validation for your sense of reality. This is not just your story. This is the pattern of thousands, perhaps millions of people walking through the world without a solid identity, living as mirrors, constantly reflecting others' judgments. And that is psychologically dangerous. Because without internal structure, you become a slave to external reactions. You have no center to return to. Jung said that the ego is not something that is born ready, fully formed. It needs to be deliberately constructed, strengthened, differentiated from both the external world and the unconscious. A healthy ego is like armor, not to make you cold or inaccessible, but so that you can exist in the world without shattering at every opposing wind. In this video, we will build that armor together. We will understand step by step how to create the psychological boundaries you never had, how to develop a self so solid that no criticism can erase you, no rejection can destroy you, and in the end you will not be a person shielded by rigid defensiveness, but someone with enough internal strength to be vulnerable without being destroyed by it. Get ready. This will not be a light conversation. But if you are tired of living at the mercy of the world's opinions, it's time to take control back. The truth, you were not born this way. You were not born with a fragile ego. This is critically important to understand right from the start. No one comes into the world carrying the certainty that they are worthless. No one is born believing that they need to be perfect to deserve love. This is learned, and what is learned can, with effort and awareness, be unlearned. Carl Jung observed, both in his clinical practice and in his deep investigation of psychic development, that many adults living in chronic emotional suffering are not fundamentally weak. They are unfinished, incomplete at the exact developmental point where they should have been structured, where their ego should have been solidified. And that is where the key to healing lies. The fragile ego is not a fixed characteristic you're stuck with. It is a consequence, a symptom of an individuation process that was prematurely interrupted. Imagine a child growing up in a home where love is a reward, not a foundation, where every gesture, every word, every expression needs to be approved to be accepted, where making a mistake feels dangerous, where showing sadness is dismissed as drama, where anger is punished or shamed. Now imagine that same child trying to form their own identity, their own sense of self. How will they know who they are if every authentic aspect of themselves has been silenced or rejected? How will they learn to trust their own emotions if every time they felt something true, something real, they were corrected, ridiculed, or punished for it? They learn too early, at a formative age, that their internal truth has no value, that only external approval matters. And because of this devastating message, they begin to shape their entire being to fit the expectations of others. And with each small concession, each forced smile, each swallowed opinion to avoid rejection, their ego disintegrates a little more. Their authentic self gets buried deeper. By the time they reach adulthood, this person lives in a state of deep inner emptiness. They may even appear successful. They may be admired by others. They may have relationships and accomplishments. But inside, all of this feels like theater, like an elaborate performance. Because the stage is entirely external, and the true self never had space to actually exist, to develop, to be known. And the worst part? Without internal references, without that solid core, any criticism becomes an earthquake. Any rejection feels like a death sentence. Any silence is immediately interpreted as abandonment or proof of unworthiness. According to Jung, this type of underdeveloped ego is not capable of sustaining psychological tension or dealing with ambiguity. It collapses under pressure because it was never properly built to endure. It was constructed only to please, to survive, to adapt to an unpredictable world where being authentic felt dangerous. And here is the truth that no one tells you directly. This suffering you carry, this overwhelming sensitivity to others' opinions, is not a character defect. It is a psychological scream from a structure that was never solidified, never completed. And what you need is not just strength in the common motivational sense. What you need is reconstruction, deliberate, conscious psychological reconstruction. But be warned, throughout this reconstruction process, you will realize that many of the defenses you use today, isolation, perfectionism, arrogance, preemptive aggression, are not actually strength. They are desperate protection mechanisms of an ego that is still trying desperately to shield itself from the original pain. And that is exactly what we will examine in the next part. Because perhaps what you think is your armor today is actually keeping you weak, keeping you trapped. If this content is making sense to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue this work. The false armor, why your defenses don't work. If you have ever noticed that you are extremely sensitive to criticism, rejection, or the opinions of others, you have probably also developed certain psychological defenses to cope with this vulnerability. Strategies to protect yourself from the pain. And here is the crucial point that most people miss. These defenses are not the true armor you need. They are disguises, broken shields, rigid cocoons that prevent you from growing but do not actually stop you from bleeding. Carl Jung was emphatic in pointing out that the fragile ego, the one that has not yet gone through the process of individuation, often hides behind defensive masks that appear like strength but are actually crystallized fear. They are survival strategies, not strategies of psychic maturity. Let's examine these false armors one by one. First, there is defensive arrogance. It appears as an inflated, almost theatrical posture where the person does everything possible to seem impenetrable, superior. They become hyper-rational, cynical, mocking of others. But just one offhand comment, one unexpected criticism, is enough to reveal what lies beneath. An absolute terror of appearing inferior or inadequate. Arrogance in this case is not genuine confidence. It is fragile armor, hastily built to hide the emptiness of an ego that feels constantly threatened. Next, we have social isolation. How many people today live locked in their own emotional bubbles? Not because they genuinely enjoy solitude, but out of fear of getting hurt. They systematically cut ties, avoid intimacy, build an invisible dome around themselves where they believe they are finally safe. But deep down, they are only reinforcing the message that the world is too dangerous and they are too fragile to handle it. The isolation doesn't heal, it calcifies the wound. And what about paralyzing perfectionism? This is one of the cruelest false armors. The person lives trying to do everything impeccably right, without any flaws. Because deep down they believe that any failure is confirmation that they are not good enough. This is not excellence or high standards. This is self-sabotage disguised as effort. It is the fear of being seen making mistakes. It is the ego desperately saying, if I never fail, maybe no one will discover that I don't feel enough, that I'm not actually capable. Finally, there is preemptive aggression, the compulsive need to attack before being attacked. People who react with immediate hostility to any criticism, who become sarcastic, harsh, or even cruel as a way to demonstrate strength. But this supposed strength is what Jung would call neurotic compensation, a desperate attempt to protect an ego that can no longer bear to be exposed or vulnerable. All of these false armors have something crucial in common. They push people away. And by pushing others away, you also distance yourself from yourself. Because the ego, contrary to what many believe, is not the enemy of connection. It is the bridge between the internal and external world. If that bridge is crumbling, your entire reality becomes unstable, chaotic, and unbearable. Jung made it clear. True psychological armor is not built with fear. It arises from the differentiation between the ego and the self, between who you actually are and who you are desperately trying to appear to be in order not to get hurt. So if everything you have built so far is not real armor, then what is it? And what would genuine armor actually look like? This is where we enter the next stage of construction. To build authentic protection, you first need to lay the right foundation. And Jung said that this foundation begins with an internal movement, creating an observer within you, someone who can see without getting confused, who can feel without being swept away by emotions. Step 1. The observer creating distance from your emotions. Most people believe they are their emotions, that being overwhelmed by sadness, anger, or shame means being sad, being angry, being fundamentally unworthy. But this is a dangerous illusion, and perhaps the greatest trap for those trying to strengthen themselves psychologically without understanding what Jung truly taught. Carl Jung proposed that the first essential step to developing a healthy and resilient ego is to create an internal instance he called the observer, a part of you that does not react automatically, does not judge harshly, does not collapse under pressure. It simply observes with clarity. And it is this capacity for separation between what you feel and who you are that begins to form the foundation of true psychological armor. What does this mean in practice? It means that when you are criticized, instead of immediately diving into the automatic thought, I am a failure, you start to recognize, there is a part of me that is feeling shame right now. Notice the profound difference. In the first case, your entire identity is swallowed by an emotion. In the second, there is distance, space, clarity. You are not the emotion, you are experiencing the emotion. This shift in internal language is not superficial or semantic. It is revolutionary in its psychological impact. When you begin to name your experiences instead of identifying with them completely, you start to break free from the cycle of emotional collapse that defines a fragile ego. Jung saw the observing ego as the bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. When you activate this observer, you become capable of looking inward with honesty, without harsh judgment. You can perceive yourself as angry but not act impulsively. You can perceive yourself as insecure but still stand your ground. You can perceive yourself as vulnerable but move forward resolutely. And that is the essence of real armor. You do not stop feeling. You learn to contain without repressing. But this ability does not arise spontaneously. It needs to be deliberately practiced. Jung believed that the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, begins with strengthening this internal observing instance. It is what allows the ego not to be swept away by the primitive forces of the unconscious, to remain centered even when everything around is collapsing. People with a permeable ego live at the mercy of every emotional wind. But when the observing ego awakens and strengthens, you begin to build the firm foundation of the inner citadel. You stop reacting automatically and start responding with awareness. And it is at this very moment that your armor begins to take real shape. But here is the next challenge. Even with this internal observer awakened, you will still remain vulnerable if you continue to wage unconscious war against parts of yourself that you do not accept. Your next step is to confront what you fear most about yourself, your shadow. Step 2, integrating the shadow, making peace with your darkness. You cannot build true armor while at war with parts of yourself. This is one of the hardest and most liberating truths that Carl Jung taught. As long as you reject the darker aspects of your psyche, you will remain fundamentally vulnerable. Because everything you hide within yourself will continue to control you from the shadows, from the unconscious. The shadow, in Jungian thought, is everything you do not want to be. Everything you have learned to deny, to repress, to hide from yourself and others. Anger, envy, selfishness, fragility, ambition, lust, laziness, arrogance, fear. Everything you deemed unacceptable because someone taught you it was not pretty, not appropriate, not kind, has been pushed into a psychological basement where you hoped it would die, disappear. But it did not die. It is there, watching you, slipping out through the cracks when you least expect it. In an outburst of anger that you immediately say was nothing. In a subtle sabotage that prevents you from completing an important project. In an envy you carefully camouflage as moral criticism of others. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It infiltrates everything you try to control without integrating. Jung said that what you hate most intensely in others often reveals what you do not accept in yourself. This is psychological projection. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. And as long as you continue believing the problem is entirely external, entirely in other people, you will never free yourself from the pain being generated within your own psyche. That is why integrating the shadow is absolutely essential to developing real psychological armor. Because a criticism only destroys you when it touches a point of your shadow that you have not yet recognized and accepted. An insult only brings you down when there is a part of you that still believes it is true. And that part has been exiled, hidden, denied, but not eliminated. Want a direct exercise? Make a list of the words that hurt you most intensely when used against you. Selfish, weak, arrogant, stupid, lazy, failure. Then, with brutal honesty, find specific situations where you actually acted that way. Not to punish yourself or confirm your unworthiness, but to accept that you are human, that these parts exist within you, and that it is not because they exist that you are less worthy. It is because you hide them that you suffer. When you integrate the shadow, you become whole. When someone accuses you of something you have already recognized and accepted in yourself, it does not destroy you. It merely informs you. Pain gives way to reflection. Reactivity gives way to clarity. And it is at this point that the armor begins to become genuinely real. Because you no longer need to pretend to be perfect to feel worthy. You are whole, containing both light and shadow. If what you're hearing resonates deeply, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day practical path. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Step 3. The Inner Citadel, building your unshakable core. Every real armor needs a core, a center. And that core is not made of external appearance or others' approval. It is made of deep convictions about who you are, those fundamental truths that remain even when everything outside crumbles. Jung understood this as the need for an ego that has a solid center, a self capable of sustaining its integrity without depending on the reflection the world gives back. The problem is that many people build their entire identity based on others' opinions. And when those opinions fluctuate, as they inevitably do, the identity collapses along with it. The result is that familiar pattern. You feel good when you receive compliments and utterly devastated at the slightest sign of criticism. This is not emotional stability. This is psychic dependency. The inner citadel is the opposite of that. It is the psychological space where you gather and protect the most fundamental truths about yourself. We are not talking about motivational phrases or egoic idealizations. We are talking about realities you have observed with radical honesty. I am a person who honors what I promise. I remain calm under pressure. I make mistakes, but I always return to center. I have integrity even when no one is watching. This is the raw material of true armor, internal evidence that you have gathered through lived experience. The exercise here is straightforward but profound. List 5 to 7 non-negotiable truths about yourself. Things you have actually lived, that you have upheld in difficult moments, that you have proven to yourself through action. When the world tells you that you are nothing, you will look at this list and remember, I know who I am, and no one can take that away from me. Jung emphasized that without this foundation, the ego cannot withstand the process of individuation. It either collapses under external pressure or becomes rigid and false, defensive rather than strong. The citadel is what allows the ego to remain flexible yet firm, open to feedback but not dominated by it, willing to grow but without selling out to please others. Step 4. Dialogue with the inner critic. Mastering your own mind. There is a voice inside you that knows exactly where to strike. It knows your fears, your insecurities, your weaknesses intimately. It calls you incapable at the exact moment you try to move forward. It calls you ridiculous when you dare to express yourself authentically. It calls you weak when you feel pain. This voice is so intimate, so familiar, that you believe it is you, that it speaks truth. But it is not you, and it does not speak truth. Jung discovered that much of human suffering arises from this unconscious fusion with the inner critic, a psychic entity formed by echoes of the past. Harsh parents, humiliating teachers, emotional abuse, constant comparisons, unintegrated rejections. This voice does not speak your truth. It speaks fear, memory, trauma, outdated conditioning. For Jung, the most powerful method to disarm this destructive force was what he called active imagination, a conscious dialogue with the inner voices. Not to silence them through force, as many try to do, but to understand them. Because everything you try to violently silence becomes stronger. Everything you try to exclude grows in the darkness. But everything you face with presence loses its power to destroy you. This process begins with a simple yet profoundly unsettling question. Who is speaking inside me right now? When the avalanche of self-criticism arises, you are not good enough. You will never succeed. You will embarrass yourself. Instead of accepting these phrases as reality, make the Jungian move. Personify this voice. Observe it. Give it form. Ask, where did you come from? What are you trying to protect me from? Why do you show up every time I try to do something new? This type of questioning dismantles the illusion that the inner critic is your true conscience, your wise self. It is not. It is an old part, frozen in time, that still tries to protect you with strategies that may have worked when you were 5 years old, but now only sabotage you. When you create this conscious dialogue, something extraordinary happens. The voice loses its tone of absolute authority. It hesitates. It responds. And you realize sometimes for the first time in your life that this voice is not the ultimate truth about who you are. It is just one voice among many, and you can choose which one to listen to. This is the final piece of armor, mastery over your own inner narrative, the ability to recognize destructive thoughts without being controlled by them. When you reach this point, you have built something unshakable, not because you never feel pain or doubt, but because you have the structure to contain them without collapsing. You have become whole. You have armor that protects without imprisoning. You can be vulnerable without being destroyed. This is Jung's gift. The path from fragility to strength, from dependence to autonomy, from reaction to response. You were not born weak. You were interrupted. And now, with awareness and effort, you can complete what was left unfinished. You can finally build the self you were always meant to become.